Yeah, Lou Gross, National Institute for Mathematical and Biological Synthesis. I really appreciated the fact that you're building something that combines data and models. And I wanted to ask you if there have been challenges with assessing the differences between data and models and putting this in a common interface.
Absolutely. And I would say that mathematicians and physicists who've been doing this for a lot longer should think of us as somewhere between first and second base. No, I mean, I think we didn't think that there was that big a difference. Now we're running into it. And in the spirit of, I think, why we're here, trying to learn from those who have realized this is about the equivalent of judging, of assessing models as opposed to data. And it's much harder than data. That's about where we are.
Martin Stevens, Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. I was intrigued by your comment that studying the individual components of a system in isolation don't necessarily reflect what perturbations to those elements would do in the intact system. This is very much relevant to where we're going in toxicology, where we're looking at perturbations to individual pathways in isolation, and through computational approaches sort of building them up into some kind of quasi-holistic system. But it's not a holistic system in the high throughput multi-well systems. These are all in isolation. So what you said relates very much to what some of us are thinking about for a future workshop, and looking at these pathways in a more integrated fashion to see how they connect and network, because as you say, changes to some of these things in isolation can lead you astray, whereas they could be buffered by thousands of years of evolution, yes, creating an intact homeostatic system.
I think very much so, and I want to. I forgot to bring something up in the talk, and that is that all that these models can do is bring up hypotheses. This is very important, and what is essential is actually to have the validation component set up as importantly as the analysis. And often the validation actually is not truth, not truth. It's about how often is that correct. And I think we have a system where the idea is I'm going to validate it and get my paper out, where the goal of the scientist is to show it correct one time. And it's actually the contour of where it applies, where it doesn't, that's actually in its richness of doing the validation. And that's considered boring work. And we have to think of how it is that we're going to incent people to do that. So I think the establishing the rules and the relationships when you're going to isolated systems is incredibly valuable. And then it should always have this little tag, and I don't know where this applies how. And that's good, right? Instead of that being, oh, well, then you can't publish it. I would argue people need to have that tag, this applies here and I don't know where else, is actually should be given a star instead of you couldn't generalize that, because I think sometimes we generalize when we shouldn't.
That's actually a good segue to my question, which is about one of your Alzheimer's example. And I'm really intrigued by this approach where you don't come in a priori with expecting to see certain things, and you find these new connections that may enlighten us about pathways that are involved in Alzheimer's. But then the tox side of me says, but there are all these other parameters that haven't been considered, and you alluded to them that there may be incidences that happened earlier in life, and what we're seeing now is really so far down the path. So have you thought about how to start building in things like fetal origins of disease, and how do you deal with that in terms of the lack or not availability of data sets that could help enlighten those what tend to be very temporally distant events?
The point that you're making in a polite way, I want to make in a stark, in a stark way, which is, I think 5, 10 years, we're going to look back on any of the models that we show, anyone shows today, and realize that they were just these little fuzzy glimpses into, and we need to be have humility and acknowledge that those that's fine, and to look at then to your question of how you add in new data. And I think the fun thing is once you have something, and I think this is what the physicists found, once you sort of know where you're trying to look, then you can bring in things and go, what is the effect of fetal this or that on that model? So I think the danger is people think of themselves as completing an arc to truth when they've just started for someone else. And I think our current biomedical culture hasn't learned the humility that the physicists have learned the hard way.
I have a question from the internet, and this is from the webcast. It's from Pat Casano at GE. And the question is, fundamentally, are you saying, and this came in the middle of your talk, so I think it's related to Marty's, and I'm not sure if I don't think you answered it. Fundamentally, are you saying that use of early biomarkers to predict disease outcomes that might result from a chemical exposure is premature unless you understand the mode of action of that chemical in the body?
Yes and no. Let me tell you, I'll try to do that briefly. What I was saying was if you take very large sets of data, 100,000 people, and you have a toxin, and you start making associations saying, is there any situation where this mutation occurred in 2 or 3 people? And you get excited because you found this particular DNA change, and here were 3 people that had exposure turn into something. I think we have underestimated the complexity of what we're looking at. And so my point was more on the fact that knowing that a particular change as an altered component list is a start, but beware of the fact that context will matter, and not start coming up with scary things. This will cause this, this will do that, until we better understand a little more about the mechanism, which may be what he was just saying.
Tim Buckley from the US EPA and Research Triangle Park. And this is a question for you, and maybe some also for the meeting organizers. And I approach this more from a human exposure assessment perspective than I do from a human health perspective. But it's my impression, my perspective, that a major obstacle for us advancing these measurements and models to inform environmental health has to do with privacy issues and IRB issues, especially when you consider kind of the smartphone technology that can inform us about where people are and to some extent what they're doing, what they're purchasing. And if I understood your point correctly, your solution to that is somehow to obtain subject permission for that data to be shared that then allows us to use it for our research purposes. So I was hoping you could clarify that point, and also if you are aware of kind of advances from the IRB perspective, because it seems to me that they're largely operating under a different kind of a framework. And are we making any advances on that front?
Oh, I'll try to, so the answer is that our suggestion to try is to acknowledge that institutions represent a third party, which by law need to have an element of protection because you don't know as an individual what that third party is going to do. So IRBs are set up to allow a third party to be saying, I'm holding this and trust me. Okay? And that's what the IRBs are doing. And the solution we've been thinking about is going to communities who have an interest in a problem and saying, what do you want to do with your data? And getting it to where once they've said, I want this done with the data, then the institution can basically share that, work with that data. So Cincinnati Children's Hospital, Mount Sinai, there are a number of hospitals that are now considering a way where every patient that comes into that hospital could sign a consent that says, I'm now somehow going to control this data. And that actually, instead of being restrictive, actually opens up some opportunities appropriately, I would argue. Where it isn't opened up, the person doesn't want to do it. And so that I don't want to spend too much time on, because it's not as easy as that. But I think the only point I want to make is when institutions are considered a third party, it's hard to consider ways of doing sharing. If citizens have a partnership with citizens in control, that may help.
So do you share my perspective that it's a major obstacle for us in moving in this direction?
I would say I have found it to be.
Thank you for such a visionary, inspiring talk. I wanted to ask if you have thought about, you touched on this point of pharmaceuticals and how our limitations in our vision just really put us down this path of single bullets for diseases, and we have to look at this overall complexity and building up all these data sharing models to try to better understand the causes of disease, presumably for the purpose of treatment. So my question is, I think there's a whole other bookend to this problem, which is treatment. So if one starts at the level of complexity and says we're trying to understand everything that causes disease, shouldn't we also be coming from the top down and saying, given what we don't know about the body and its ability to heal itself or to look at a more holistic way of treatment, which I think pharma has been very negligent in, and our funding mechanisms also are very negligent in trying to.
Yeah, I think yes.
How do you approach that other direction?
So a very, I think a specific answer I can tell you about more is one of those other 5 projects is with Fanconi anemia, where the risk of getting a second cancer, head and neck, is very high. And what we're doing is letting the patients' narratives about what they think was going on in their lives come in, match with the photographs they're willing to take all the time of their mouths, connect those to the researchers who have a real interest in that area. So I actually think it's very important to bring in that spectrum. Insights from patients in large numbers worked in partnership have a value.